In the previous episode of this series, I reviewed the four gospel versions of Easter morning, the empty tomb stories. We saw contradictions, confusion, fantasy features, and improbabilities. The authors of this gospel folklore made things up. Probably, totally, they made things up. Why do we suspect that? The writings of the Apostle Paul are a dead giveaway. Paul's letters are a major portion of the New Testament, and he wrote long before the Gospels appeared. One of Paul's obsessions was the resurrection of Jesus. Believing in the resurrection was the key for being saved. He preached Christ resurrected incessantly. Don't you think he would have been thrilled, delighted to talk up the empty tomb? What a great story. Christians today see the empty tomb as proof of the resurrection. Yet in all his letters, not once does Paul mention the empty tomb. In his letter to the Galatians, one of the key texts of the New Testament, Paul says this: "When God was pleased to reveal his Son to me so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles, I did not confer with any human being, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were already apostles before me. But I went away at once into Arabia, and afterwards I returned to Damascus. Then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas," which is another name for Peter, "and stayed with him 15 days. But I did not see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother. In what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie." End of quotation. Wouldn't you think that after Paul's dramatic conversion, his famous road to Damascus experience, he would have rushed back to meet with the disciples, to find out all he could about Jesus, whom he had never met? But no. After 3 years, he met up with Peter for 15 days, but gee, what did they talk about? In all Paul's letters, he never mentions anything at all about Jesus' preaching, parables, miracles, healings. It's as if he had never heard of any of these things. And it's especially conspicuous and mysterious that Paul doesn't talk about the empty tomb. Not a word. It's not a stretch at all that the empty tomb stories had not been invented yet. We know that so much about the empty tomb was invented because the four stories are different and conflicting. Folklore was taking its natural course. But here's another important thing to consider. Paul might have rejected the empty tomb stories. Most Christians like to think the body of Jesus came back to life. The blood started pumping again. He began breathing again. He stood up and walked out. In John's Gospel, the newly alive Jesus invited doubting Thomas to touch the sword wound in his side. But Christians don't grasp that Paul undermines that. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul realized that a body that had been dead for 3 days would be disgusting. So he came up with the idea of, wait for it, a spiritual body. This is what he wrote: "So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable. What is raised is imperishable. What is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a physical body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a physical body, there is also a spiritual body." A spiritual body? That's an oxymoron. But like most theologians, Paul specialized in making things up, and it didn't have to make sense. So, the physical body of Jesus walking out of a tomb? Paul would probably have been alarmed at the very idea. The New Testament can't get its act together. As scholar Randall Helms has said, the Bible is a self-destructing artifact. But the guys who eventually wrote the empty tomb folklore knew what would sell.